Overcoming by Pure Foy's Girl. Chapter 7. Hannibal woke the next morning rather later than he intended, but though he had gone to bed at a decent hour, he had lain awake several hours after thinking of Will Graham. Unusual was too paltry a word to use to describe the Omega his cousin had married him to. In less than a day, he'd been suddenly dressed down, made to look a miser by the state of Will's belongings, smacked with a fish in a burst of unexpected violence, and honest to gods teased at his own table. Teased! Antithesis of everything Hannibal knew was true might be a better description, all things considered. Hannibal had seen for himself the changes in the village and in the house itself, the updates to the fixtures and plumbings that brought it back on par with modern homes, the cottages and new businesses in the thriving town adjoining the estate. If he gave credit to Anthony's nonsense, then Will had done a passable job attempting to keep Hertford House afloat in the absence of a true estate manager. It was very difficult for him to think that a lone Omega had been able to mastermind such things without racking up a mountain of debt, but Grandfather would never allow such flagrant spending for long, and Will had proven he was a tad more than unusual in most regards. Hannibal knew firsthand how difficult it was to manage a holding this size, having watched his grandfather bear up the burden for the years that he had lived here with him. It gave him a curling tendril of admiration for Will that he had attempted such a task on his own, despite what nature had stacked against him in terms of sense, reliability, and motivation. Yes, he was willing to concede that Will was not entirely bereft of brains, but he could put all that nonsense behind him now and turn his curly-haired head towards his own interests, which no doubt included watercolors, gossip, and an extraordinary amount of embroidery. Feeling rather proud of how understanding he was being of his mate's inherent faults, Hannibal got out of bed and readied himself for the day with Berger's assistance, wondering if Will had managed to acquire more trout for breakfast. Will, however, was not present for breakfast, he found. In fact, he was quite alone in the large dining room that seemed very vast and empty to him in that moment. "I trust you are well, my lord?" Mr. Hawkes politely inquired as breakfast for one was situated on the table for him. "Ah, yes, Hawkes," he said, frowning softly. "I'm afraid even after so long away from war, I'm still an early riser." "I hear it has begun anew, my lord," Mr. Hawkes said, instructing the staff with subtle, almost imperceptible gestures. "And with great fervor." "Indeed it has," Hannibal agreed, his frown deepening as there was still no sign of his spouse. "Definitive this time, I hope and pray. Tell me, Hawkes, where is my spouse this morning? Commanding breakfast in bed, I suppose, or is the hour still too early?" "Mr. Graham is in the estate manager's office, my lord," Mr. Hawkes answered, delivering the paper still warm from the housemaid's iron. Footmen ranged along the wall as if an army waited to break their fast instead of one slightly disgruntled marquess. "As he usually is this time of day once he finishes his ride to the village." "When does he normally rise?" Hannibal asked, surprised. His father's Omega had slept until well after noon, and complained if awakened earlier. "Before dawn, my lord," Hawkes said, gesturing a footman to bring over his tray. "Usually around 10 minutes to 5 is when he has his breakfast, my lord." Hannibal frowned, saying, "Good gods, how industrious." "He is often very busy, my lord," Mr. Hawkes said, his voice never wavering from sullen monotone as Hannibal was served, "and is usually occupied until dinner. And my cousin?" "Left for Fernhill this morning after sharing toast and coffee with Mr. Graham, my lord," Mr. Hawkes somberly told him. "It is somewhat of a tradition of theirs these past years." Hannibal didn't like the sound of that one little bit. He angled a glance at the lined and proud man who had served the Lecter family since he'd been nothing more than a coal boy, knowing if anyone would give him the truth of things, it would be old Hawkes. "What is he like, Mr. Hawkes?" he asked, taking up his silverware, an image of Will sliding his spoon into his mouth, reminding him violently that he must have the tableware changed out. "Very competent, my lord," Mr. Hawks said, standing to one side with dignified grace. "Mr. Graham is exceedingly meticulous. He has a very quick and curious mind that has become quite an asset to Hertford House, and his grace relies on him heavily." Hannibal nodded slightly, mouth pursing with thought. "What is the village summation of him?" he asked. "I'm afraid he is rather reclusive, my lord," Mr. Hawks easily answered. "He is often not recognized as your spouse." That brought an unbidden chuckle to the surface, and Hannibal asked, "I assume he sets them to rights." He rather hoped a trout or two had been involved. "On the contrary, my lord, he does not claim any ties to the Lecter family at all," Mr. Hawks said, a faint note of disapproval finally threading its way into his voice. "It is a mistake he fosters in order, he insists, that he may do his work without distraction. But he is very kind to the staff when he is not required to be, and takes a personal interest in all of us." Hannibal mulled that one over, digging into his breakfast with sudden appetite. He recalled his conversation with Mr. Woodward, and realized with some surprise that the old baker had been speaking of Will as an acquaintance, not as Hannibal's spouse. It was quite a curious thing. Mystified, he asked, "Is that why you all refer to him as Mr. Graham?" Hawks cleared his throat, uncomfortable, and said, "He was quite insistent, my lord, that you would find it distasteful otherwise. He seems to be unshakably convinced that his place here is only a temporary one." Hannibal frowned, idly swallowing the bite he'd taken. He honestly had not expected Will to think much of any of it, flighty as Omegas were. He imagined Will had been quite happy here at Hertford House, lording his position over Hertford Town, buying all manner of nonsense, and spending his days painting watercolors no one cared to see, and singing songs no one cared to listen to. He never dreamed he would hear that Will had not only not done just that, but had actively encouraged people to assume he was no one of consequence. It was entirely unusual. "Yes, well, I suppose it suits him," he finally said. "I cannot imagine anything an Omega would like more than being fawned over with a bevy of my lords, but he is a rather unusual creature. He is thoughtful, polite, and unassuming," Hawks said, rising to sudden and surprising defense of Hannibal's spouse, "and we would all very gladly drown him in, my lords, if he would stand for it. Perhaps, my lord, you might have a word with him on that count. It is not entirely proper that a marquess be spoken to in such a common way. It is entirely beyond the pale that a noble should be confused for a commoner." Hannibal eyed his stoic face, quite sure that Hawks had just given him a means with which to grant Will his place here while rescuing his own pride. "I will consider it," he said, turning back to his breakfast, and surprised himself with his own sincerity. He read the paper, finished his breakfast, and meandered out into the pleasant mid-morning air to walk the half-mile or so to the estate manager's office and let himself in without knocking. He found Will there just as Hawks had said he would be. His dark curly hair was bent to his books, and a pair of wire-framed spectacles were perched on his nose, giving him a scholarly air quite at home on him. "I'm busy," he said by way of greeting, only then looking up at the man before him. "Hannibal." "I've come to check the books," Hannibal informed him, feeling strangely like an intruder, which only irritated him. If Will was surprised to see him, he did an excellent job of concealing it. "Yes, I imagine you have, considering," Will said, straightening. That one hung in the air, a defiance of Hannibal's opinion that Omegas lacked both the brains and motivation to do anything more than lie on their backs. It quite surprised Hannibal to hear him say such a thing. It was completely at odds with the boy who had collapsed into a heap of disgrace at very little provocation. It was very much in keeping, however, with the young man who had slung a fish at his face in frustration. "Hawks assures me you've been very meticulous," Hannibal said, unsure how to rescue himself from that one. He could catch no scent from Will, no trace of his Omegan self even this close. There was no trembling, no subservience, no sign that he saw an alpha before him, and that unsettled Hannibal. Will, he decided, unsettled him entirely, in fact. He was too calm and collected now, as if entirely unaffected by 6 years of separation. He'd made it clear that he was no longer frightened of him or intent on deferring to him. He was absolutely out of character for an Omega, and it was absolutely uncalled for. Hannibal took a step further into the room, hands clasped behind his back, looking it over as if searching for any sign of lack on Will's part, but actually just finding a convenient excuse not to look overlong at Will's large blue eyes and poised face. "So much has changed in the last 6 years," he remarked, attempting to engage him in conversation and offer an apology of sorts for his unintended insult regarding their talk of the estate last night. Too, he knew, if he had any hope of getting the child his grandfather had contracted for, he would need Will's consent. He was coming rapidly to the conclusion that it would take more than a few sparkly, distracting baubles to divert Will Graham. Perhaps an allowance to make those purchases on his own and pretend independence? In response to his meager attempt, Will only said, "Yes, I find the house much more pleasant now," Hannibal went on, glancing over his shoulder to see if Will would be flattered by that, at least. Appealing to an Omega's vanity was a certain way to gain their favor. Will didn't appear to be flattered in the least. He was looking at his balances again. Instead of fawning delight at his accomplishments being noticed, he merely said, "It needed updating. I didn't want your grandfather living in unseemly conditions." "Ah. We used the estate surplus, of course," Will said, lifting his gaze again with something like fire in his eyes to add, "in case you were worried I was spending your inheritance." Hannibal frowned. Will smiled, slightly, a flitting ghost of a thing, and idly tapped the quill of his pen against the desk, waiting with polite impatience for Hannibal to do whatever it was he wanted to do and get out of his hair. Hannibal had never been made to feel like a pest before, and he didn't like it one bit. "I'm thinking of bringing my daughter here now that the house is so well kept," he said, watching Will carefully for signs of distress, wishing now to get a reaction out of him, some sign that he could be provoked as he'd been yesterday, when he'd been barefoot, unkempt, and entirely furious. Will tilted his head and shrugged elegantly. "I assumed you would want her near you if you decided to stay." "I'm thinking of bringing her mother as well." "It would certainly be less troublesome than hiring a nurse," Will said, tickling the tip of his own nose with the quill now, bored with their conversation. Bored! Hannibal found himself incredulous, to say the least. "Let me know when she is to arrive, and I'll pack," Will said, standing up and straightening his papers. "Pack?" Hannibal asked, a faint tone of condescension coloring his voice. He had found something that bothered his spouse at last? Was the prospect of living here with Hannibal's mistress and child finally enough to send him into a typical Omegan tantrum? "I would imagine she'll be needing the adjoining suite," Will briskly said, setting his desk to rights and straightening to meet Hannibal's gaze without reserve. "It would seem strange, after all, if the spouse you despise has more status in the house than the woman you've chosen to have children with." It was so damnably practical that Hannibal scowled at him, unable to find even a trace of the boy he'd been married to in the young man before him. "And where, pray tell, would you go?" Will shrugged again, as if he hadn't thought about it, before saying, "The city, perhaps. It's been 6 years. I could visit my sisters, or just take over another one of your estates and make it productive. Oh, well, as productive as I can manage with my feeble intellect and inconstant nature. It's no business of yours what I do." Hannibal bit back his retort at the mocking way Will sent his own words back at him, unwilling to open that particular door. Before he could sufficiently recover, Will moved the opposite way around the desk, avoiding him and heading out the door, calling, "Everything should be in order. If not, feel free to blame my empty-headed vanity for claiming so." Thinking that had not gone at all as he had planned, Hannibal settled at the desk and opened the account books with a heaving sigh of bored resignation, the faint trace of Will's warmth evaporating quickly with his absence. Will took the long way back up, cutting back across the hedgerow to meander through the garden. He knew every square foot of Hertford House inside and out. The gardens, the vast forest where game slid sly-eyed and fearless, the echoing halls with their disapproving portraits, labyrinthine passages that ran between the walls, connecting the rooms in a maze of escape routes, the cellars with their bellowing furnaces spilling heat up waiting pipes. He knew it all as intimately as he knew himself, but that did not make it his. Neither familiarity nor a duke's decree would give him a right to stay here. Not now. Not any more. He kept hearing Hannibal telling him that he would bring his mistress and daughter here. He kept hearing his own calm reply, said with a detachment that had surprised even himself. Because he didn't feel detached. He felt insulted and, above all, angry to the depths of his soul that all he had worked so hard for would be lost all over again, just as it had been in his father's house, and it would not matter that Hertford House was his. He could not imagine dislodging Hannibal Lecter from his ancestral home if he decided to stay. Will would be forced to leave, or else spend the rest of his days living alongside his spouse's real and desired family. It took a long time of walking to work off the worst of it, and remind himself that he had no say in things. Hannibal was his husband and, by law, could do as he pleased. Will, as his Omegan spouse, had no other choice but to accept it. But that didn't mean he had to accept it gladly, or easily. "Mr. Graham, the Duke would like to see you," Will was told the moment he made his way up to the house proper, Mr. Hawkes appropriately blank-faced. He was, however, well acquainted with the many types of blank faces the aging butler could give, and knew that he was excited about something. "Thank you, Mr. Hawkes," he said, striding through towards the Duke's suite, ignoring the flurry of servants around him, but wondering why they were suddenly so energetic. He knocked softly and let himself in, calling ahead, "Grandfather, it's Will."
"Ah, Will, come here,"
the Duke said, sounding more lively and aware than Will had heard him in months. He found the elderly Duke up and dressed, and already in his wheelchair, looking such a picture of health that Will wondered at it.
"Come here, my dear,"
the Duke said again, gesturing him closer to the desk where he was seated. "Has something happened?" Will asked, crossing the room to lay a fond hand on the man's shoulder, the only affection he ever allowed himself. "You seem very hale this afternoon."
"I am feeling much relieved to have this business with Hannibal settled,"
the Duke said, poring over something before him. "Is it settled, then?" Will asked, unable to bring himself to ask what would become of him.
"Yes, all neat and tidy,"
the Duke said, scrawling names down.
"Nothing to worry yourself over, my dear. Hosting a small dinner party to celebrate Hannibal's return and your marriage, as we never had a formal reception. There will be another one, no doubt, when you remove to the capital for season, but this one is for family, close friends."
"Grandfather, I don't think holding any sort of celebration of my being here is all that Hannibal could ask for," Will said, voice tightening with worry as he gazed at the length of the list. "I have already quite ruined one homecoming for him. It wouldn't do to ruin another."
"Nonsense," the Duke said, chuffing his displeasure. "I have been absent of company some 6 years now for the sake of his temper. The least he can do is indulge me in this."
"I have no desire to burden you, Grandfather," Will said, his thoughts still tangled up in Hannibal's statement. "But I need a wiser, clearer head than mine right now."
"Well, I'm older, my darling boy,"
the Duke said, amiable with him.
"What is it? Why are you so pensive, Will?"
"I think it would be appropriate if I leave Hertford House," Will said, concern pinching his voice small, a distant echo of the frightened, uncertain boy he'd hoped to leave behind him. "Perhaps after the dinner party."
"Certainly not," the Duke said, indignant. "Hertford House is your home."
"No, Hertford House is Hannibal's home. He is a Lecter," Will said, feeling the pain of that statement deeply. "He should be able to live here comfortably, and he cannot do so while I remain. Perhaps if I am gone, he will grow bored of life in the countryside on his own, and return to the life he enjoys. Will you not reconsider your decision to give the estate to me?" The Duke's keen brown eyes searched him, knowing he was withholding more than he was sharing, but willing to let him keep it to himself if he chose. "I am increasingly less comfortable here," Will admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. "In truth, I do not belong here, and I never have."
"You do belong here, and I will not allow you to dash off at the first snarl from my grandson. Now don't fret, Will,"
the Duke said, patting his free hand, but briefly, knowing very well that Will disliked being touched by anyone any more.
"I will see that you are well cared for, and being well cared for means having a proper introduction to polite society. You are a noble, Will Graham, in your own right, no status from my family aside. You have no reason to hide your face here at Hertford House, and Hannibal can help undo some of the damage he has done."
"It is the damage I have done that he fears," Will mused, still thinking of their meeting in his office, "as he is even now reviewing the ledgers for some clues to my treachery." The Duke snorted and laughed shortly, saying,
"He'll be lucky to find a stray penny."
He handed Will the list he'd been working on and said,
"Run along. Give that to Hawks, my darling boy. I expect he and Mrs. Henderson will organize, as they always do."
"Yes, grandfather," Will said, wondering what on earth the Duke had bartered to settle his argument with Hannibal. He could not imagine what the Duke's intentions were regarding his place here concerning his grandson and heir, when the disposal of Hertford House was such a large wedge between them. Troubled and thoughtful, he sought out Mr. Hawks and handed over the list, asking, "Is this what has the staff so excited?"
"Yes, Mr. Graham," Mr. Hawks said, fair beaming with delight. "At long last this house will be as it was. Mind you, most of the younger staff will be quite silly, but I am pleased with the announcement all the same."
"I confess I am not," Will said, distracted and uneasy, his thoughts dwelling on the happenings at Marsham Heath. When Mr. Hawks arched a brow in polite inquiry, he said, "The Duke wishes to make this a celebration of Hannibal's marriage."
"You mean your marriage, Mr. Graham?"
Mr. Hawks inquired, his tone delicate.
"I should think some celebration is in order. You've been 6 years out of society, Mr. Graham. If Lord Clarges intends to stay, as he has said, then I expect society will be rather more present."
Will frowned, quailing at the thought.
"The Duke is starting small, which is some comfort, Mr. Graham, is it not?"
"Not nearly as much as banishment, Mr. Hawks," Will said, giving him a weak smile, "which I should prefer to Lord Clarges taking the opportunity to denounce me in public." Mr. Hawks sighed heartily.
"I am very fond of you, Mr. Graham."
"As am I of you, Mr. Hawks," Will said, his smile genuine but worn with too much thought.
"I would like to reassure you that Lord Clarges is too much a gentleman to take such action,"
Mr. Hawks assured him, solid in his faith. "I wish I could share your certainty," Will said, exhaling on a sigh, his stomach tight with dread at the eventuality of Lecter relatives, and Hannibal's life without him descending on him in due time. He very much wished to tell Jimmy to pack for him and remove himself to another estate altogether, but no matter what happened, Hertford House belonged to him, and he had a responsibility to care for it properly, if only for Hannibal's own children. "Have my mare saddled, Mr. Hawks," Will said, deciding to stick to his own schedule. "I'm late for my rounds."
"Yes, Mr. Graham, of course."
Hannibal found nothing untoward in the books. Indeed, the more he delved into Will's work, the more admiration he began to feel. For all intents and purposes, his Omegan spouse had dragged Hertford House up by the bootstraps and forced it into screaming compliance, if the early years of his efforts were to be believed. His deft business sense had allowed for profits that stacked with each year, building on investments made the year prior. He had to hand it to him. Will Graham knew how to plan long-term, and was not one to indulge in quick schemes. Tenancy was up to full capacity, and Will had, with the Duke's permission, even purchased and annexed packets of land from the impoverished, nearly extinct family of nobles who had once neighbored them. Hannibal was left wondering what on earth he planned to do with it. He was well and truly astounded and, truth be told, rather ashamed of himself regarding the assumptions he'd made about Will's intelligence. In Hannibal's 6-year absence, Will had managed to make headway no estate manager had been able to in decades. It was no big secret that great houses like theirs were falling to decay and bad business all around them. Seeing his ancestral home thriving while others failed brought a quiet sense of pride to him. Pride in Will's actions. pride in Will's keen foresight and admirable mind. He was no simple, childlike dimwit idling away in a drawing-room, wasting space, air, and money. He'd seen a problem, found the cause, effected a solution, and did the job better than the man who'd come before him. It was far better a job than Hannibal himself might have managed, he knew. He wondered if there was any way in which Will Graham betrayed his Omegan nature, as he had yet to see it. With nothing to pick on, and deprived of Will's presence, Hannibal quietly left the tidy little office and took the path back up to the house proper, aware in a vague sort of way that there was unusual activity among the domestics. They were very much like a disturbed bee's nest, buzzing and milling in agitation. A footman spied him coming up and hopped to get the door, even if it was unorthodox for a marquess to use the servants' entrance. Several of the other house staff just stared at him in consternation, caught in the middle of their cigarettes and letters, unsure how to react. Hannibal ignored them and entered the house, moving with swift, easy grace down the hall and turning up the servants' stairs to emerge on the main floor, near the front door, in time to hear Will request his horse. "Saddle my stallion as well, Mr. Hawks," he called, gloating somewhat when Will was startled into looking at him, his annoyance apparent on his lovely face. It was quickly replaced with blank indifference, and his face just as quickly averted, which left Hannibal scowling slightly as he reached him. Mr. Hawks wisely took himself out of earshot to give instructions to a footman, leaving Will alone with Hannibal in the foyer. Hannibal smoothed his waistcoat, aware that he was grooming again, but unable to stop himself. Not that his mild peacocking made a bit of difference to his composed spouse. "Back so soon, Lord Clarges? I had thought you would take rather more time to thoroughly investigate my wrongdoings," Will said, turning away to present Hannibal with his profile and the slender sweep of his shoulders. "Yes, well," Hannibal said, shifting slightly as if he'd done something wrong, which only irritated him. "Naturally I could not take the time to look through all of it. I will have the accountants come in for that, though I do admit to being curious as to why you are amassing land like a general." "Who knows?" Will said, cocking his head to angle an irate look Hannibal's way. He wasn't wearing his spectacles, and his eyes were large and gleaming, the sparkling color shifting from blue to green and stormy gray depending on how the light struck. Hannibal found it vastly unsettling to see. Proper people's eyes did not change colors, or cause a gentleman's gaze to linger over long where it should not. He could not fathom how Will could be so uncommon in every respect he was capable, and thought it must be from sheer spite. "Though I am sure you have your sound theories." "Considering what I know of your capacity for violence, I shall keep my opinions to myself," Hannibal said, too proud to admit that he was brimming with curiosity to know what Will had planned, as he was far too intelligent to have made the purchases impulsively. "If you wish to ensure your safety from my violence, then you have my delighted permission to avoid me." "Nonsense, I will accompany you," Hannibal said, picking a bit of lint from his jacket and dropping it with a wrinkle of his noble nose. "'Tis grandfather's wish that we spend time together." "That was your grandfather's wish 6 years ago." Before Hannibal could scold him for being so abrupt and surly, Mr. Hawks returned to open the door for them to meet their saddled horses on the drive. "Thank you, Mr. Hawks," Will said, striding swiftly away to mount his horse with feline grace, settling into the saddle and gathering up the reins with slender, deft hands. "Thank you, Hawks," Hannibal echoed, rather shamed into it as Will was so persistently polite to the staff. Entirely uncalled for, in Hannibal's book. He settled into the saddle and turned to tell Will as much when he realized his mate was already riding away, as if he simply couldn't wait to get away from him. From him! Offended, Hannibal urged his stallion after Will's sturdy little mare and overtook him on the lane heading opposite Hartford town. The dirt trail Hannibal knew from his childhood here, which led on to the next town, worn flat over the years by merchants moving back and forth over the land, had been replaced as well with cobblestone. The entirety of the area had, in his absence, been connected up to the greater roadworks. It was quite the undertaking, he realized. A road to connect Hartford House and Hartford Town to the main roads was one thing, but finding it extended past those bounds was even more impressive. "These roads are quite an improvement," he said, hoping to coax Will out of his silence. It is a wonder we never had one in before now, really. Must make everything much easier for everyone." "It does," Will said, a soft smile curving his full lips. Hannibal caught a bare glimpse of it before Will turned away, ahead of him enough that it blocked Hannibal's view of his face. "Long overdue," Hannibal decided, straightening in his saddle and moving abreast of him. "Very clever, though, whoever brought it to fruition. No doubt the city council." "No doubt," Will said, chuckling softly, turning his head away again when Hannibal glanced over at him, catching a bare glimpse of his lovely profile. It brought an uncomfortable reminder to both of them of that day 6 years ago, when Hannibal had reacted so violently to little more than Will simply looking away. Hannibal found himself thinking of that day and frowning at his memory of Will, slight and far too young, staring up at him with tear-filled, terrified, bewildered blue eyes. It gave him a pang of guilt that refused to be quashed when its source was so enticingly present and entirely changed. "I assumed you had better ways in which to spend your time, Lord Clarges," Will said, riding with purpose but not precisely haste, "then waste it on me." "I had arranged a gap in my calendar to come deal with grandfather," Hannibal said, realizing that Will's destination was Gold Meadow Farm, the first of the estate's farms let out to rent. "I will have to make further arrangements, of course, considering I intend to stay. For now, I will ensure that Hertford House is not suffering from your handling." The half-hearted remark got the intended reaction. Will cut a sideways look at him that was quite menacing. Hannibal feigned not to have noticed, though he was pleased that his needling at least got a response. "And what is our business here?" he asked instead, seeing that the farmer and his older son were turned out in the front yard, clearly expecting his visit. "Every first Tuesday of the month I get reports from the dairies," Will said, lifting a hand in greeting. "Production, head count, and the status of their needful items, any concerns they may have." "Goodness, how clever," Hannibal said, brows rising, unwilling to admit to Will himself just how intelligent Hannibal found him. Unable to resist needling him, he asked, "Who told you to do such a thing?" Will ignored him, choosing instead to call a greeting ahead and urge his mare faster. He drew to a stop, swung down with supple grace, and was shaking hands with the farmer by the time Hannibal arrived.
"Ah, Lord Clarges! Heard you was back, my lord. Riding the rounds this morning, seeing how the old homestead is coming along, my lord."
The pink-cheeked, rather round fellow beamed at him while a strapping huge lad strode off with Will towards the shed, already in deep conversation. It was fairly irritating to see. "Forgive me," Hannibal said, easing from his stallion's back. "When I was a child this was the Osgood family farm."
"Ah, well, we're the Pattons," the man said, beaming at him. "The Osgoods moved to a bigger farm, bless 'em. Mr. Graham found them a tenancy that suited them and their hogs better, and had us in since we got the best heifers in the area."
Hannibal looked around with critical eyes, noting the tidy state of the place, the signs of a happy and thriving home. He could see the cattle in the distance, ranging, unpenned but for the bull, who was safely enclosed. The lane passed by with neat cobblestone path from the dairy branch out to meet it. "And does your situation here suit you?" Hannibal asked, lacking any sort of good conversation material. He very much doubted Farmer Patton was either interested in or aware of the latest opera in the capital. "The Osgoods had a devilish time getting their meat to market, if I recall correctly."
"Oh, aye, my lord, they did,"
Patton told him, unmindful of a pig-tailed little girl who ran up and started swinging from his burly arm. Hannibal saw a whole passel of round and bright-eyed children slowly emerging from the house, enticed by the presence of an unfamiliar face.
"But the lane here is a blessing indeed. Halves the time to get to town, makes it easy to reach the road to the capital. Why, once the rail comes, we'll be fair set on, won't we?"
"Indeed," Hannibal murmured, trying to parse out where on earth the rail would run through this area since all of their available land was being used. Except the land that his clever little spouse had begun parceling up in his absence.
"Not to step out of line, Lord Clarges, but I wanted to say how glad we all are that the Duke hired in Mr. Graham,"
Patton said, dragging Hannibal back to their conversation so abruptly it must have shown on his face, because the man promptly added,
"It's just that. He done so much for us, your lordship, investing in our businesses, having all them roads built, to put a fair number of men into honest work, even setting up buyers in the capital. We all hope once you take over, you'll keep him on for all the good he's done here."
"This road," Hannibal echoed, dumbfounded. "This road right here."
Yes, my lord,"
Patton said.
"It's one of the first things he did when he took over. Built the roads up, didn't even up the shares for Hartford House. Said it would pay for itself, and it has."
"Wait, Patton," Hannibal said, his surprise about the paven road giving way to genuine bewilderment. "Did you say you hope I'll keep him on?" "I wouldn't exactly word it as hiring him in, sir." There was a long, cautious silence. Hannibal could see Will returning with the farmer's older son at a sedate walk, with less urgent conversation now.
"Begging your pardon, my lord,"
Patton said, unsure where he'd gone wrong.
"but as your land agent,
that," Hannibal said, pointing at Will, "is my spouse." Patton stared at him, his confusion evident. "Why do you have that look on your face like you're confused?" Hannibal demanded, scowling to see Will look up at that boy, tipping his face to meet the smile of the much taller man.
"'Cause I'm confused, my lord. Not to speak out of turn, but most times noble don't marry the land agent."
"He is not my land agent. He is my spouse. He was my spouse 6 years ago when he first came here, whatever he allowed people to believe afterwards. Why do you still look confused?" Patton's eye slid to Will. With no other recourse to soothe an addled and powerful alpha, he said,
"It's just, well, he a man, ain't he? And every day Duke's heir marries a man."
"He is an Omegan," Hannibal said, pointing at Will so that there was no mistake. "Omegan! How is this a mystery? Why has no one come to this conclusion? He is Omegan, and he is smiling. Why is he smiling?"
"I wouldn't dare say, my lord,"
Patton told him, looking at Will with a fresh perspective. His voice was thoughtful and vague when he added, "Omegan? That explains why he's so pretty." "Pretty?" Hannibal echoed, rounding on him, shocked that someone might make such an observation about his spouse. "I beg your pardon?"
"Beautiful, my lord,"
Patton hastily corrected himself, no doubt thinking he had offended his future duke with such a summation.
"He's very beautiful, my lord."
"Yes, he is," Hannibal said, surprised into agreeing, unexpected as it was. "And he is currently smiling at your son. He never smiles at me, not in any kind of nice way."
"I'm sure it's just his temperament, Lord Clarges,"
Patton said, thoroughly exhausted by their conversation.
"He's a most solemn little fellow, truth be told. Stern as a vicar most times, but very good at his job."
Patton flushed brick red, embarrassed to have brought up Will's questionable status as Hartford estate manager. "Mr. Patton," Will called, finally reaching them, irritated when Hannibal moved to insert himself between the Patton lad and his spouse. Shrugging it off as more of his nonsense, Will said, "Everything seems to be going well. Have you any particular concern for me?"
"No, my lord,"
Patton stammered, flushing harder and looking away. "My lord," Will whispered, looking from Patton's round face to Hannibal. "I see. Well, I did mean to let you know that there will be someone replacing me very soon."
"Well, we understand your lordship, don't we?"
Patton said, eager to make it up to Will.
And I apologize for how I treated you in the past."
"How have you treated me that you think you need to apologize for it, Mr. Patton?" Will asked, grim and increasingly unhappy.
"Well, I mean, we didn't know, your lordship,"
Patton said, fumbling over the words.
"I mean, we never would have said some of them things in front of you, spoken so easy with you, had we known you was a noble and an Omega."
Will flinched, but managed to nod softly. "Yes, well, I am certain my replacement will suit everyone much better. Thank you, Mr. Patton, for your kindness in indulging me so long." Will quickly mounted his mare, ignoring Hannibal's sharp call after him. Hannibal excused himself without further ado and went after him, catching up to Will in the midst of pasturage where he turned off onto a dirt trail. "I suppose you're very pleased with yourself," Will said, refusing to look back at him, stiff with offense. "Is there some reason I should be ashamed of myself? Why on earth did they believe you're the land agent?" "Because I am!" Will snapped, guiding the horse along the trail. "Well, in a manner of speaking," Hannibal said, conceding that point. "You have substituted in the role admirably. But they do not seem to be aware that you are also my spouse. I assumed Hawks was exaggerating when he said no one knows who you are."
The townsfolk I can understand, but certainly the tenants must know. This is not a secret that would keep in such close company."
Will said nothing, which only served to rankle Hannibal.
"Why did you never correct them?"
"To what end, Lord Claudius?" Will asked, ducking low to clear a tree branch which Hannibal himself nearly rode straight into, he was so intent on his mate.
"Well—"
His reasoning failed him. His assumptions, he knew, would not sound the same coming from his mouth as they did in his head. "Because you could. Not everyone does things because they can," Will reminded him, letting the mare pick up her pace once they were clear of the small hedgerow. "Not everyone is like you, Lord Claudius." "What is that supposed to mean?" "I am not lowering myself to a discussion with you on the subject," Will said, aware of Hannibal's darkening scowl. "Suffice to say, I had no more desire to be associated with you then, Lord Claudius, than I do now."
"Do you seek to offend with every word? You are my spouse,"
Hannibal said, huffing with indignation.
"Your desire to be associated with me notwithstanding."
Will pointedly ignored him. It was entirely unsettling. Hannibal glowered at his back, annoyed. He could not fathom why Will had kept his status a secret. He would have imagined that Will soundly corrected anyone who misidentified him, Hawks's assertions notwithstanding. His father's concubine would have flown into a spitting rage to be mistaken for a land agent. She no doubt would have died of self-immolation to have actually performed the duties of one. She certainly would not have done so with anywhere near the success Will Graham had. Frowning, Hannibal cleared his throat and loudly scolded.
"You should have told me the road was your idea."
"It is infrastructure, Lord Claudius, not scientific advancement," Will said, refusing to look back at him. "It hardly matters whose idea it was. What matters is that it is there, and it does its duty."
"Well,"
Hannibal said, pride thoroughly pricked, and expertly so.
"How interesting to expect the road to do its duty when you will not."
Will did look at him then. A flash of angry, narrowed blue eyes filled with far too much consideration for Hannibal's comfort. He was very glad there was no trout at hand. "Pray tell me, Lord Claudius, what duty I have failed," Will said, gazing steadily at him. "As I recall, it was not I who left Hertford House in a snit." Hannibal had good manners to flush at that one, Will was pleased to see. "This is the land you asked about," Will said, back to doing brisk business. He drew his mare to a stop just at the start of a flat meadow and looked out across the rolling waves of grass with the fond pride of a mother beholding their brood. Hannibal's eyes flicked over him, and he shifted, discomfited by Will's lovely profile. He recalled his irate exchange with Patton, and bristled, thinking of Will smiling at that hulking great boy, and himself defending Will's beauty with such instant and automatic affront. But he was beautiful. To say otherwise was to blindly lie, and the proof was before him. Will glanced his way, his dark brows slamming down over his bright blue eyes when he caught Hannibal inspecting him. "If my appearance offends you, Lord Claudius," he said, his voice low, dangerously soft, "it would behoove you not to stare at me."
"I thought you had a twig in your hair,"
Hannibal said, looking at the meadow with a perfunctory air. "So much for honesty."
"And what am I to make of this?"
he asked, irritably aware that he sat straighter in his saddle with his shoulders squared, spurred to present an appealing image in the face of Will's frank disapproval. "Or might this have something to do with the rail line Mr. Patton spoke of?" "The rail line is cutting north from Chesterton," Will said, oblivious to his jibes and not the least bit surprised that Hannibal had gleaned his intentions. He pointed his slender finger in the direction of the town he'd mentioned. "I've spoken with the surveyors and seen the plans. They intend to bring the rail straight through here and on to North Loxtow."
"So you purchased the land before they did," Hannibal mused. "They have the law of the land."
"I have offered them use of the land without argument if they would place a station at the south end of Hertford Town," Will said, soothing his mare when she shifted beneath him. Hannibal's brows rose with surprise. He was impressed all over again with Will's forethought, and was forced to admit that his spouse was surprisingly insightful and bold on top of being alarmingly clever. The rail company agreed, Will said, no sign of pride or bragging about him. It will profoundly benefit your tenants and the townsfolk, and improve the distribution of their goods to the buyers. Hannibal absorbed that, considering all the facets to such an advantage. The rail line will pay for the station, of course, Will said, taking his silence for disapproval. And I negotiated a lifetime contract for a flat rate for any goods sent under the Hartford stamp. You are very determined that our people are well served, aren't you? Hannibal asked, a small smile tugging at his mouth when Will huffed softly, impatient with even the hint of praise. It was my place as the estate manager to see that the estate is productive, Will said, turning away to give Hannibal a view of his dark curls and the delicate curve of his ear peeking out at him. For that, the tenants must be productive. It was all necessary, Hannibal. I realize that, Hannibal said, admiring Will's quick, decisive actions to secure the estate's success. You surprise me, Will. Will shot another glance at him, his dark glare softening somewhat when he realized that Hannibal wasn't disapproving of him. You are truly unusual. I am practical, Will said, blushing slightly and turning his mare entirely to escape Hannibal's handsome smile and his unconscious, charismatic alpha draw. I have a duty to ensure that this place does not suffer in your absence. So tell me, Lord Clarges, do you still believe Hertford House is teetering on the brink of ruin? No, Hannibal said, surprising Will when he reined his stallion around in front of him to get an unobstructed view of his face. I believe you have acted with impressive verve for someone with no practical experience in running an estate. I stand corrected. Will's eyes widened so much that they showed white all around. His expression of stunned shock was so amusing that Hannibal chuckled softly and told him, Even my stubbornness has its limits, Will. Will got himself under control and averted his face again, tipping his head down in that effacing way of his, managing to turn his mare at the same time so that he swung away towards the next farm on his rounds. Something about his reaction made Hannibal's grin widen, warmth blossoming in his chest for no reason he could imagine. He reasoned that it was because he'd rendered Will speechless. But deep down, he knew that it was because he was finding Will to be far more intriguing than he'd ever imagined.